Hi everyone, welcome to a special edition of History Respawned. This week we are attempting to do a live Let's Play over Twitch. And this is a bit of a kind of a trial run to see how it goes. The game we've decided to play is the new downloadable game Assassin's Creed Chronicles China. And my guest for today's show is my co-host on History Respawned, Dr. John Harney. John, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bob. And hi, everyone who's watching. Good to be back on the show again. As a guest, you know, so I get special treatment as a guest, right? That's how that works.
That's right. That's right. I've rolled out the digital red carpet for Dr. Harney.
That's what that was.
Yeah, that's right. That was that noise just a moment ago. So this is a good episode for us to try it on. It's a Assassin's Creed game, obviously one of our favorites here at History Respawn. But it's also on China, which is your area of expertise, John.
Yeah, I mean, the Ming Dynasty is a teaching field for me as opposed to a research field. But I'm much more comfortable talking about China than pretty much anything else. And this is exciting, you know, the Assassin's Creed games. I mean, this comes up all the time, Bob, of course. It features in History Respawned, but it's exciting that they go to these different locales. I was excited when this game was announced, actually, obviously because I'm, you know, a China nerd, I guess, a China historian, but it's just exciting to get away from Central Europe. I know the first game obviously was set, you know, kind of in the Middle East and everything, but this was an exciting thing when it was announced.
Yeah, so they've got a setup here, and it tells us in China 1526. So I'm wondering if you could kind of take a look at this script and kind of pick it apart for us a little bit.
Sure. So first of all, 1526 is right kind of in the middle of the Ming Dynasty, which runs from 1368 to 1644, and by 1526... It's around this time that the Ming Dynasty is starting to decline. Now, they'll collapse in 1644 as a result of invasion by the Manchus, by Manchurians, who later formed their own Ching Dynasty, which runs until 1912. And just looking here at this text, I see a group of eunuchs known as the Tigers. There was a group of eunuchs known as the Tigers, and they actually served under the emperor who died, I believe, in 1521, the Zhengde emperor. And that's kind of typical of the politics of this time. The Ming Dynasty, you see, early on was dominated by very strong characters. Hongwu Emperor, the martial emperor, very successful military man. The Yongle Emperor, who was the patron of a famous encyclopedia and built essentially the Great Wall of China as we recognize it today, but also famously killed a Confucian scholar that defied him and had his family killed to the 10th degree, and they spent decades hunting down the family members of this poor guy, you know. But it was a system that relied quite heavily on a strong emperor. And what starts happening in the 16th century is they get some emperors that aren't so strong. They have emperors that prefer to just kind of read up on Buddhist classics, and they have emperors that prefer to spend all their time with their concubines, and they have emperors that like to drink. And the emperor who died a couple of years before this game was set was so unpopular that his own concubines tried to kill him. And in 1526, I believe it's the Ching emperor, and that emperor was also kind of notorious in Chinese history. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's the antagonist of the game. As for the Tigers being Templars, obviously that's Assassin's Creed lore, you know, pretty clearly.
No.
The other thing here that's interesting is so Wang Ming has this role as this leader of the assassins. Wang Ming was a Confucian scholar at this time, and very influential now, and you know, I teach about him in history classes, and at the time he was kind of unpopular with his fellow elite intellectuals, and they kind of quasi-banished him to the south coast. You know, they kind of sent him away from the capital to a job that wasn't quite as prestigious as their jobs were. So his ideas were unpopular at the time, but one of the things was he was quite a strong advocate that, you know, if you were a carpenter, for example, and you really liked being a carpenter, and you really enjoyed your work, and you really dedicated yourself to it, and you were a moral person, that in your own way you were fulfilling the Confucian ideal, that so anybody could do it, and it really opened up this idea of sagehood to literally anyone. And so Wang Ming would be a very prominent philosopher in Chinese history, historically speaking.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting that Wang Ming is, you know, seems to be from this text as a a handler for the assassins, and that kind of follows in line with the Assassin's Creed series, where in particular in Assassin's Creed 2, Ezio's the main character's handler is Machiavelli, and it's
That's
of
right.
course the game's set in Renaissance Europe, so. I could kind of see why the series likes to align itself with ancient philosophers, and usually philosophers that were in some ways ostracized later in life.
Yeah, that's kind of a really cool thing. As much as I think Assassin's Creed, and this comes up all the time in the series, they kind of do their own thing with history, but you kind of get the impression those consistencies kind of give a good vibe. Do you know what I mean? You kind of get this good impression of how they're doing it. It kind of makes it works out.
Where is the rest of it?
So here's some kind of emissary from the Emperor there, I guess, who's holding a box out in front of her.
Yeah, and so it states that our protagonist used to be a concubine as well.
Oh, right, okay, that's interesting, because, the choice of a female protagonist is quite an interesting one, because, I'm sure a lot of our viewers are familiar on some level with the idea of China being a very patriarchal society, and the Ming are replaced by the Ching in 1644, and the Qing don't bind their women's feet, and whereas the Ming do, and the Ming, you'll see a lot of Ming influences in video games all the time, like Jade Empire, for example. Jade Empire is arguably more Song Dynasty, because the Ming Dynasty has its reputation as being kind of Chinese, in quotes, because the Qing that followed were Manchurian, they were kind of foreign, and you have these Ming loyalists reacting against the Qing that follow. And in a Ming society, women were very much... One of the few modes of agency you could have would be to become a Buddhist nun, perhaps, but also if you were, frankly, attractive enough, and if you were acknowledged by somebody in the emperor's retinue, you could become a concubine. And some concubines were really politically active, and some just had a hard life, as they served their singular function, or they had an easy life in terms of being taken care of, but they were basically there to provide to be sexual partners for the emperor. That was the whole point. So it's intriguing that she used to be one. That's kind of historically speaking, there wouldn't be a lot of people who... There wouldn't be a lot of living women who used to be concubines. That wouldn't be a common thing. Because you wouldn't willingly leave it, and if you did leave it, it would be for unpleasant reasons. So here's a guy getting...
I'd imagine... I would imagine that there was maybe sometimes a complicated relationship between the court eunuchs and the concubines. Is that correct?
Oh, very much so, yeah. So, one of the big problems you have with the Ming... So, the Ming is a really interesting period because it's kind of simultaneously... There are some very, very authoritarian, even by Chinese imperial standard, leaders early on. But it's also a period when some of China's most famous novels are written. Dream of the Red Chamber, Journey to the West, and things like that. But it is this time that is characterized by this disharmony at the highest levels. And so you have factions at the highest levels. And you have the Wan Li Emperor, who reigned a couple of decades after this game is set, very famously wanted one of his concubines' sons, who was not next in line, to be the next emperor, and got into this huge controversy with his advisors. And so in the imperial court, you have concubines playing some concubines playing a role politically, but the eunuchs and the Confucian scholars really, really going against each other, And the eunuchs have this really interesting position because, so eunuchs... They're allowed to stay in the Forbidden City because they're not able to impregnate women, and they can be trusted in theory, and also because they couldn't have children, and at this time a lot of politics is built around securing advantages for your son or for your next in line, right? That's how you're building power over generations, not just over your own lifetime. But of course eunuchs were taken out of that equation because they couldn't have children. So what the eunuchs start doing later on in the Ming is that they start adopting people and naming them as their heirs and all this kind of stuff. It really gets complicated. And the Confucian scholars, who of course are the ones who eventually write the histories, very much paint the eunuchs as these horrific villains. And so they would be the bad guys in some ways of the Ming, and they would kind of carry the can for the political problems that led to the collapse of the Ming. in the eyes of the historians writing this, they get to write the history, so they get to control that narrative.
So as you see here, we've just started a new game. We're getting a lot of tutorial guides here, so I do apologize for that. I know how tedious that is to watch, let alone play, actually.
Yeah, somebody somewhere must like these. That's the only explanation I can think of. For it's I guess every game has to be designed with the idea that the person playing it has never played a video game.
Yeah, I think so. And this game, as a lot of critics have noted, bears a lot of similarities to Mark of the Ninja, which came out several years ago, and has a lot of the same style and aesthetics.
Yeah, these mechanics are very reminiscent of that game, actually. Diving into darkness there. You see those statues in the background she just walked past a couple of seconds ago. I think those are references. They look a little bit like Guanyin, which is a Chinese bodhisattva. China in the Tang dynasty, which is the 7th century to the 10th century, could be seen as a Buddhist state, and it's kind of the one period in Chinese history where you could really argue that it was a kind of a religious state, not a theocracy per se, but dominated by a religion. But after that, although Buddhism is no longer dominant, it is part of this set of beliefs. You have Buddhism, you have Taoism, Confucianism, and also local gods. And so you see these little statues. One of the successes Buddhism had in China was that it incorporated these local gods, and they became a bodhisattva, a bodhisattva isn't a god, but it's higher than a saint in kind of a Western Christian tradition. And it's this person who could achieve nirvana, but they're deliberately sticking around to help us, the rest of us, achieve nirvana. And in practice, what you have is you have statues you go to pray to for people to get better, or relationships to get better, to find a job, you name it, In present-day East Asia, you can go to temples and you can pray to certain bodhisattvas that your exams go well, just as an example, So it's kind of intriguing to have these little, they're obviously meant to evoke that kind of a statue. They're not trying to be fully accurate, but it's a nice little touch. Well, I'm not sure what the character of this prison is, and it's just interesting. It doesn't seem very practical.
Good to have you back.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense to me. Well, so, how did religions get along in this area of Chinese history? Was it a case where there was a dominant religion and it attempted to hold the other religions back, or was it common for them to kind of coexist equally and harmoniously?
Well, that's a really good question, and so I kind of answered to the best of my ability, but any Chinese religion scholars who will watch will be disgusted by me. But Buddhism arrives in the 1st century AD from India, and one of the interesting things about China is that Chinese culture was so predicated on the concept of Chinese superiority. And not even superiority, but it's not that the Chinese felt they were better than others, it's that the Chinese felt they were civilized and everybody else was a barbarian. That was it. That was all it was to them. And so it's kind of surprising that, in theory, that they would like this Indian religion. And what happened in practice was a lot of Chinese scholars had to translate Sanskrit texts into Chinese and everything else, and they kind of sinified the Buddhist religion. They became a kind of seen as a Chinese religion, and especially after the collapse of the Tang, Chinese religious practice, the word syncretic is sometimes used. Basically the idea is that your average Chinese person has a religious, especially at this time, has a religious practice that is based on a fusion of Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, and isn't necessarily identifiable as any one of those things. And in the Ming, it gets really interesting because you have local villages that are actually petitioning the government saying, our local god, the god of our local lake or what have you, should be seen as an important god. We want you to give him the title of Duke of this part of the afterlife and stuff. And the government would do it, to keep people happy. And so there's just this really kind of, oh dear, it all went badly. So religion in China, it's really interesting because there's a lot of things. You'll meet people who are you would have met people at the time who were fully fledged Buddhists, and some who would say they were Taoist, and people who were just much more influenced in the kind of local shamanistic, local god cults and things like that. But for a lot of people, all these things kind of bled into each other, you know. And that's where, again, where you see these statues in the background. The bodhisattvas were a part of that. So whereas 10 generations earlier, your ancestor worshipped, you know, such and such a god of the trees, you now pray to this bodhisattva, who is exactly the same thing. They've just kind of, I mean, this is being far too facetious, but they've kind of rebranded it as a Buddhist deity, you know? But it's an intriguing, it's a mixture of beliefs. And the big thing about Chinese religious practice at this particular time, it's all very heavily based in rites. And so ancestor worship is always the big thing. Always, always, always. And then there's a certain amount of deification of Confucius and kind of respect paid to him. So, you know, if you're performing your rituals, and in particular if you're paying the proper homage to your ancestors who have passed away, then you're being a good person in that spiritual, by that spiritual measure. Here we're seeing, you see, she's up on this, seeing a bit of outside now. You see this is nice, these little blurred trees and mountains in the background there, and the little bit of architecture. These are little attempts to kind of just allude to traditional Chinese art, I suppose, and they're quite nice. Chinese art, you know, really, there's a lot of focus on bodhisattvas, on Buddhist gods, a lot of focus also on scenery and tranquility and harmony and all these kind of various things. So it's a nice little touch from the art design there, I think, to kind of... It's a neat trick too, because you can keep it blurred like that, so you have to worry about rendering and stuff, but I think it works quite nicely aesthetically as well.
Absolutely.
And I should point out that all these, they're all speaking in accurate Chinese. I mean,
are they really? I was just going to ask that.
I mean, that's something that has gotten a lot better in video games over the last several years. Because I think there's so many Chinese Americans, but also Chinese people who work in game development now that it's just not that hard to get someone to do it, you know.
There's no excuse.
There's no excuse, especially Ubisoft's, you know, budget and everything. But yeah, so they're speaking, you know, completely accurate Chinese.
So, would the Chinese that they're speaking at this point, would it be very similar to what we have today, or I mean, I don't know how much you know about the linguistic history of China, but I mean,
that actually is a very good question. So, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, it would be very similar to what today we consider, you know, to be Mandarin, right? Now, I'm not sure where she's supposed to be in China right now, because we, of course, call the language Mandarin because it was the language used by the Mandarins, right? The scholar officials who were the civil servants, essentially, who ran the country. So in Chinese, the language is called Putonghua, which is like ordinary speech. So basically, it's based on the Beijing dialect, but it's spoken by scholars. So whereas today, in most parts of China, people can speak Mandarin to you. Maybe heavily accented Mandarin, but still Mandarin. In the 16th century, it's going to depend where you are. You know what I mean? People are going to be speaking Cantonese or Xiang or whatever their local language is, rather than Mandarin. So I guess you could argue that's a bit anachronistic, but you know, you're also at the point where you're kind of you can only do the best you can. Do you know what I mean? And I feel that, like, especially for a modern audience, and this is my opinion as a game player as opposed to an historian, I feel like you're doing what you can to create some kind of authentic experience for your players, you know?
My revenge can begin now.
But certainly, so if the character will be in Beijing, then yes, they will be speaking that language, no question. Very, very similar to Mandarin today. Whereas, I believe at some point she's down in the southeast in Fujian, and in Fujian they would speak an entirely different language. But they would write the same language. So the language when written is always the same. But when spoken, it's very different. And that was something, if you go back to the 3rd century BC, the famous Qin emperor, he unified 15 different scripts into one. And so educated people, regardless of what language they preferred to speak, they could read and write in classical Chinese, which was consistent across all the different spoken dialects.
We've got a pretty annoying tutorial here of showing attacks.
Attack this enemy. Show me how you strike with your sword.
This is a little bit unfortunate. I mean, I'm not necessarily playing in like cultural commentary or so, but I noticed that she has a guy who is speaking in accented English, and that's kind of a bit of a bummer following the.
Excellent. Heavy attacks
It's just
deal more
it's just a bit of a cliche.
See, the enemy is now weakened.
Which again,
Well,
maybe,
in the well, and then the protagonist herself has an English accent, so
yeah, I think that's just video game rules. So like, women can have English accents, and dwarves have Scottish accents, and I played. I don't mean to digress too much. I played The Witcher 3 recently, and I was delighted. You get to an area and everybody sounds like they're from Ulster, which was I really liked that because I grew up in Ulster, and it was really nice to hear all the accents. So yeah, I don't know where her English accent would come from. Again, you got to give him some slack. I'm not a fan of the "it's a video game" argument, but
Well done,
at some
son.
point you got to say it's a
Your
video game.
training is complete.
it's a video game.
At some point you
And-
have to say that.
And it's a French video game, which the French Canadians also, they tend to like a lot of diverse accents in their games,
right.
even if the games are occurring in the exact same area.
And I would, by the way, when I say it's a video game, I mean in the same way that certain movies you can say it's a movie, and certain books you can say this is what the guy's trying to do. So at some point you kind of, I feel like so far in this little bit I've seen of the game, there's enough to they've earned a little bit of good faith, it seems.
Absolutely, yeah.
So more of this kind of religious imagery, these kind of statues and candles, and not entirely sure. I mean, I guess they're conveying kind of a rustic theme, and to be fair, that's something that so again, a very colourful, again, because it's a video game, you get this kind of probably quite impractical prison environment. It reminds me more of Star Trek V than anything else. Just this.
Yeah, I can see that. Absolutely. The great Star Trek V, where Kirk gets God.
I should actually take this. I should be speaking about history here. This is actually a good point to talk a little bit about how the legal system worked traditionally in Imperial China. It could be very repressive by modern standards, At various points in the Ming, you kind of have the same old system going back to the Qin, which is an idea of collective punishment, which is that the Chinese society at this time was organized by something called Baojia, which was a kind of a loose system of collected households that were essentially kind of monitoring each other and run by society heads. And if a member of your family, for example, committed a crime and you hadn't turned them in, you could be also prosecuted for a serious crime as well. And in the Ming in particular, the Ming have a reputation for this, and the Ming were very, very careful about when an emperor made a decree, and in these pre-modern imperial systems, an imperial decree is essentially automatically law, right? They would have the decree read out loud in public, and they would have it nailed to a wall in every village. And the idea was that everyone knows it now. And so anything even approaching sedition or failing to stop someone in your family from doing something that was perceived as being against the emperor could see you executed or just thrown into a cell for the rest of your life pretty quickly.
Wow.
And particularly sedition was the big fear they had, was the Ming emperors. And the Ching emperors that followed were even worse in that regard. But so and this is life. Life wasn't pretty for most human beings for the majority of human experience, So in that sense, the prison is kind of authentic to a certain extent.
Yeah. And, what you were saying about the legal system, I mean, that holds true for a lot of European societies at this time where, sedition is the big problem or the big fear, and it was very common that, it could just be one family member that was involved in the sedition, but, having one family member almost implicated all the other family members because of this kind of, pre-modern clan-like nature to societies where, one member of the clan could, draw down the rest of them by some evil deed.
Yeah, and that's actually a great point, because this is something I say in classrooms all the time, which is, it can be very easy to kind of get the hang of or they kind of decide, oh, well, that's Chinese. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something intrinsically Chinese about such and such a practice, and
right.
A lot of the time, it's got a lot more to do with, in this case, the government system, right? You know, you have these authoritarians who have zero interest in anybody questioning them or undermining them, and they're, you know, in some cases, depending on the emperor, depending on the ruler, are paranoid about rebellion. You know, they're kind of seeing rebellion where there's nothing.
This was once a safe
and as a result, you have these extremely stringent legal kind of systems.
Saw to the end of that. Their forces surprised and overwhelmed us, all but wiping out the Brotherhood. Gao Feng's death will send a message to the Templars.
Excuse me.
The assassins have returned.
And I should point out too, I mean, again, speaking about human experience being difficult, so the emperor who reigned until shortly before the setting of this game, the one whose concubines tried to kill him, they messed up, basically. They didn't succeed, and so a number of them were killed. Death by slicing was one of these traditional punishments, which
oh my gosh.
remained on the books until 1905, and it's also known in the Western world as death by 1,000 cuts, where they would just cut bits of your flesh out of your body and just take their time doing that and just, you know, let you die slowly. And this would, you know, so this would be a suitable punishment, for example, for a concubine who tried to kill her emperor. Like, this would be this would be, according to the letter of the law, what a horrifically dishonest and awful and immoral thing to do, right? And so it justified that kind of a punishment. So, you know, this was, going against the emperor was an astonishingly risky thing to do for anyone who wanted to do it, you know?
Right.
And so again, I suppose this game, you know, it's about an assassin and everything, and the standard mythos of Assassin's Creed, going against authority, like the stakes are significant.
Yes.
Not to say that the emperor is leading an evil empire per se. I mean, by present day standards, it's kind of horrifying, but the stakes are definitely high for the character of the game. There's a lovely callback, isn't it? That's a Assassin's Creed staple. Jumping into a big basket of hay.
Yes, they have those in China as well. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, exactly.
And some more climbing obstacles. This seems a bit more, what's the word for it? A bit more open than the last area with the prison. It seems like there's a lot of different ways that I could attack
Right.
This area.
Yeah,
of course, that's just my perception of playing for the past few minutes. But
it's interesting thematically as well, because it's kind of, you know, she's out in the open, or some kind of almost like a village or countryside kind of setting, and we're getting a chance to see more of that kind of art style, like not just in the background, but even kind of the little brush patterns they have there in the foreground and some of the rocks and things like that. Again, it's a kind of it's a nice little homage or a nice little gesture, I think.
it's a good aesthetic, I think.
Yeah,
And it's interesting. In this downloadable game, it's supposed to be the first in a series of 3.
Right.
And the other 2 games are supposed to be set in Russia and India. So we'll see if those games have the same aesthetic, the same kind of brushstrokes as this, or if they adopt something that's a bit more appropriate for those 2 cultures.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, because it's kind of again, I think that my personal view with these video games, it's a little bit, there's always a balance, isn't there, between the art, and I don't, not just the visual art, but just the art of making a game versus what you're trying to do thematically. So I think that's a nice example, these little brush strokes. It's reminiscent of Chinese art without being overly kind of stereotypical, or I don't feel it's overly stereotypical,
or
at least,
or right on the nose. Yeah, you don't want too much.
It's a little reminiscent. I embarrass myself now forgetting the name of the game, because of course we're recording live. I remember that GameCube game. I guess it must be a 10-year-old game now, where the whole idea was to have these. It was a Japanese themed game with brushstrokes and stuff. I think there seem to be artists in the video game industry that, if they get a chance, love to break loose of some of these Asian themes, you know.
Yes. All right. Well, I love. The game plays very well. Really good stealth mechanics here. And also I like even though it's a 2D game, 2-dimensional, it's got some sort of occasional three-dimensional elements where I can maneuver around different points on the map, and just like I did there with the climbing up the pillar. So that's a nice touch. I think it gives the game a little bit more dynamism than what you'd expect from a traditional 2D game.
Yeah, and it's nice. This is a nice little thing as well, because although this is a fictional location, there were locations like this in China. You kind of have these villages, or sometimes, you know, maybe a shrine or something is kind of built into the mountain or the hills in such a way. And there was this deliberate attempt to take advantage of the local kind of the local energies and things like that. You know, there's a lot of, you know, Taoist theory is all about yin and yang and complementary energies and all this kind of stuff. And you know, people today know about feng shui, and people our age at least, Bob, probably think of feng shui as something that yuppies did, you know, in the 80s kind of thing. But there's actually a lot of interesting theory behind it, and at this time, 1500s, of course, these are really governing architecture decisions and everything else. So this is kind of a nice little location here, kind of a mixture of, you know, of human settlement, but trying to kind of yield to nature. There would have been a lot of philosophical underpinnings behind those kind of places in China at the time as well. So it's kind of nice, another nice little touch.
Interesting. Looks like we have some explosive falling objects will distract the guards. Okay, let's try this out. Alright. Well, as traditional for Assassin's Creed games, there is quite a bit of climbing. And it's nice to see this game kind of exploring more stealth elements. I think the last few games have gotten really heavy on the combat, and I'm not sure combat is really the series at its best.
Yeah, this is a series, you know, Bob, I don't know how you feel about it, but as an historian, back when even the first game came out, but even the second game came out, I didn't foresee it becoming this enormous, you know, franchise, almost including this Chronicles game now, a genre-spanning franchise. And I'm kind of delighted as someone who likes history and video games, because the whole point of the series is to have, I know there's obviously a sci-fi central narrative, right? But the whole point here is to have a stark setting, so I'm excited by that. But I just didn't see it coming, you know. And like you say, that to be at a point where there have been so many Assassin's Creed games, there are ones that maybe get away from what actually makes the games good, you know.
Right. Maybe just borrow the the kind of story elements, but not necessarily the type of game that it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it looks like I might be in trouble here. Let's see if I can get out of this.
I'm getting Metal Gear Solid vibes from this alert mechanic. I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's difficult to have a stealth game in the last 20 years without some sort of influence. So now I'm stuck in yet another tutorial. And this one is a bit more inspired by the Matrix here, where I have to somehow dodge a bullet as it's coming at me.
Yeah, I quite like the armor. I couldn't say I'm an expert on armor of the Ming period. I mean, it looks relatively right to me, like crossbows and things, like kind of handheld crossbows. I mean, the Chinese had crossbows a lot earlier than other people, but they were these crossbows that involved using the entire human frame to actually fire an arrow into the air. They were almost like one-man mobile artillery catapults kind of things.
Right.
Going back to like the 3rd century BC. Going back a long time.
well, you'd have to imagine that one of the reasons why they have heavier crossbows because maybe there's better access to better armor, but then also they're having to face off against pretty well-armed horse warriors, usually, in this region. So having a larger crossbow would give you maybe the potential of taking down a horse rather than just a man on a horse.
Very much so. I mean, the Ming, early on, the Ming had some very successful military campaigns down in the southern borders near modern-day Vietnam. Later on, the Ming struggled in Vietnam. In fact, they had some pretty, some emperors were downright humiliated. One Ming emperor took off and basically had to be ransomed back, which, was kind of unthinkable. That the son of heaven would have to be, that barbarians could collect money for his safety. This is kind of a crazy thing. So you kind of have these, you have these large military campaigns against the Hui and against other peoples in modern-day Vietnam, and the Viet, of course. But you're right, up in the north in particular, which of course is, Beijing is in the north of China, the capital. And it was the Ming, by the way, that chose Beijing as the capital in the early 15th century. Or moved the capital there, rather. You're dealing with these, these horse lords, and China had been conquered by them only a couple of centuries earlier, so that was the threat. Long term over the centuries, the Chinese tended to shift between tactics with those peoples to the north of them, and for a long time they would negotiate with them, and sometimes they'd marry daughters off to them, and sometimes they would just give them money or trade them silk and porcelain for good horses or whatever it was. But of course there was an awful lot of combat as well, and that definitely influenced the technology and the choices of the army compositions and everything else.
怎么回事啊？抓住他！真让人希望了，刺客。
Well, I think we've seen, I think we've seen a good fair bit of this game so far. Why don't we step back a little bit and see what we can see from the Animus Database? Usually this is a good location for historical material, and then we can wrap up the show for today. So we've got Animus Database. Typically this is where a lot of the historical material is. Ubisoft packs in a lot of factual material, some of it fictional for the characters, but also sometimes it's got actually historically researched material as well. So we've got some descriptions here for our main character. We've got some for looks like some of the local Templars who are in the game, and then of course is something as innocuous as dogs.
Well, it's under Xiao Jun's biography there a second ago, it's kind of, so I guess the plot of the story is that this emperor is kind of the puppet of the eunuchs, and of the specific eunuch group, which obviously is fictional for the game, but that was kind of the overriding, that was the main political problem in the Ming, and historically speaking, looking backwards. And now, of course, as historians are wont to do, you have competing narratives, right? You have historians taking different positions. So a more recent position would kind of argue that actually the emperors were kind of reacting as best they could to what was essentially a gridlocked political situation. So a little bit like American Congress in the last couple of years, for example. This is kind of, it's dysfunctional, it's not working, and so the emperors refusing to participate was less about them wanting to drink or to fornicate or to pray. It was about them, this was their solution. So that's one take. And the more traditional take is that, again, the eunuchs were these kind of these bad guys with or not bad guys, it's obviously too simplistic, but that they were out for themselves and didn't care about the greater state. So I would argue Jia Jing in real life wasn't a puppet of eunuchs, but there was a big argument that he was far too accommodating towards them. And that's an interesting kind of translation from a genuine historical scenario into a fictional story.
As we would say in America today, he's too beholden to his special interest group.
Yeah, that's actually a very good analogy. That's what the eunuchs were, and for people watching as well, these eunuchs. So these are men who normally around puberty or so have been castrated, which is why they're allowed to stay in the Forbidden City at night. Men aren't allowed in the Forbidden City at night, but eunuchs are because they're not men. And what it means is that they're, in some cases, raising these emperors from boyhood You know, like they're always there. They're servants. And so one of the reasons they were so influential is because emperors trusted them, and emperors had been around them their whole life. And so there was this kind of tendency, there was this willingness of emperors to listen to these guys, you know. So it was kind of a natural avenue for them to manipulate the emperor, which is what they sought to do.
Well, I think that's going to do it for us today on History Respawn. Thanks for joining us for this kind of trial into streaming. John and I will try to do some more of these, maybe with some of our guest historians. But thanks especially to John for giving us so much detail on this game, historical background. So good work.
Well, thanks, Bobby. You know, it's always nice to it's nice to do a show with you. You know, when I come on as co-host, I'm like, I guess we're not going to do a show together again. So it turns out we can do a couple now and again. I hope the people watching like this as well, and hopefully we can keep them coming.